Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today's great political fiction is a work of science fiction. It is the book that we have had the most requests from listeners to include in this series, and I am very grateful, because I think it is one of the most interesting books about politics I have ever read. It's Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, and it's about imagining a world without the state. Without Leviathan. Is it possible to construct something that we could call a realistic utopia? So it sounds like an odd question because it sounds a bit like a contradiction, a realistic utopia, given that the point of a utopia, utopian thinking, is to imagine a world that doesn't exist. Utopia means no place. A fantasy world where things could be better than they are in our world. Different, remote, inaccessible in some ways, and therefore a place where the imagination can run wild. So if you then try to make your utopia realistic, what's the point? As soon as it becomes realistic, doesn't it lose its utopian qualities? That's the question. But I think it's fair to say that a lot of people who have tried to write in one form or another in a utopian vein have tried also to make that vision as realistic as they can, because the problem with utopian thinking is it's so damn utopian, remote, cut off, fantastical. Wouldn't it be more powerful if you could make your utopia somehow plausible in the world that we find ourselves? Make it more realistic, and then people are more likely to buy into it. So there are different ways of trying to do that. One, which is associated sometimes with the American philosopher John Rawls, who used the phrase realistic utopia in his own work, is to think in an ideal frame of mind, come up with the ideal conditions for a society, a political society. So in Rawls's case, ideally, what is justice? What is fairness? What would it be to live in a world in which the conditions of justice and fairness are upheld in a way that we recognize as something like the best they could be? So you do that thinking, which is in a way utopian thinking. What is the best version of a society that we can imagine? And then, having come up with your ideal conditions, you compare them to the world that you find yourself in. What would it be like if those conditions were applied to our world? And in Rawls's terms, at that point, you may need to adjust your ideal conditions if they seem too remote, if they seem psychologically implausible, if they seem institutionally unfeasible. They need tweaking, they need adjusting, they need bringing a bit more down to earth. And one of Rawls's methods of doing political philosophy was precisely that back and forth. Ideal conditions then compared to real world conditions, meaning an adjustment of the ideal conditions, a tempering of them, so that you end up with something that does seem plausible or feasible in the world in which we live. That's one version of a realistic utopia. But there is another way of doing it, which would be to, again, ask the question, what is our ideal setup here? What's the best that we can think of to construct that system or institutional form of living? And then to ask, what kind of world that we would recognize as being in some sense a real world? Doesn't have to be our world, but a world that we can recognize as being realistic. What kind of world would make it possible to live like that? So this is a different way of doing the argument. Not tempering the ideal conditions to our world, but trying to find a version of life, its institutions, its psychology, its political arrangements, in which those ideal conditions might hold, might persist, might not fall apart. So that's more like world building. And if the first, in the example I gave from Rawls, is exemplified in political philosophy, that second method is much more like a work of fiction. Indeed, I think the genre in which you are most likely to find it is science fiction. Construct a world and fill in all the details, all of the little gaps fill them in with real people, or at least realistic people, doing realistic things, and see if you can build a world in which those ideal conditions hold. They don't fall apart. And that's the method applied in Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed. Indeed, I can't think of any other book that does that in a more realistic way. It is, I think, and it is a work of utopian fiction, the most realistic utopia I have ever come across, or at least within this novel, because there are different worlds in this novel. One of the worlds that's described is the most realistic utopia I have ever come across. The ideal conditions that Ursula Le Guin was interested in come under the broad philosophical heading of anarchism. She wants to imagine an anarchist society, and then to imagine what kind of a world, what kind of a setting might allow such a society to hold together. The anarchism that she has in mind is real-world anarchism in the sense it draws on influences from the 19th and 20th centuries. The Dispossessed was published in 1974. Part of its inspiration is 19th-century Russian anarchism, particularly the work of a celebrated Russian anarchist, Peter Kropotkin, but also 20th century anarchist arguments, a writer forgotten now more or less, but quite influential in the 1960s, called Paul Goodman, who was an American anarchist particularly interested in the conditions under which young people, teenagers, might feel genuinely free. It's also partly inspired by the kibbutz movement in Israel, which is not strictly an anarchist movement, but certain kinds of real-world communal living that had survived and indeed flourished certainly in the 50s and 60s. It's worth remembering, a very different world from now, the extent to which, particularly for people on the left who wanted to think in a utopian vein, Israel through to the 1970s remained a significant inspiration. The core to these various anarchist philosophies is the absence of coercive authority. That is the basic ideal structure that Le Guin is interested in exploring. What it would be like to live in a society in which there was no state and none of the instruments of state coercion. No police force, effectively no law in the sense no law that can be enforced with coercion, with the threat of violence. So this is a society in which there are no prisons. At one point in the novel, a group of children living in this world hear a rumour of a thing called a jail, a prison. They've never come across such a thing. So they incorporate it into their games. They play a game in which a group of them put another of their number in a little holding cell and they lock the door and they keep that person in overnight. They play at prisons and they are horrified because they've never heard of such a thing, at just how appalling it is, what a traumatic experience it is. And they are also so ashamed, they don't want their parents to know that they played at prisons, that they never speak of it again. It's like they've done some terrible, shameful thing that can never be discussed in front of the grown-ups. No police, no law, no prisons. But it's also not a primitive society in the sense that it has the institutions of modern life in it. So this is not a world in which these things don't exist because people are living in tiny communities or purely agrarian lives. This is not something from 50,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. It is recognizably of our world. This is science fiction. It's futuristic, so you can't date it. But it feels, to be honest, quite 20th century. This is a world in which there are universities, there are cities with quite sophisticated infrastructure, there is extensive transport and communication, there is industry, there is a complicated network, not just at the university level, but more broadly, of education and educational institutions. So this is a recognizable world of the kind that has in it the things that we would expect in a sophisticated society, but it does not have law or the state or the police or a prison system. It does not have any form of coercion. And so the question is, given most of our assumptions, would be that you can't have complex social, industrial, economic structures. You can't have sophisticated networks of 20th century style human endeavor in the absence of some overarching authority that keeps the renegades in line, that tells people not just what is expected of them, but what will happen to them if they sabotage or attempt to destroy or refuse to comply with the overall system and structure. How are you going to deal with the people who are purely selfish? How are you going to deal with the people who don't share your values? How are you going to deal with the people who just don't want to play along with this system? If you allow people to do whatever they want, won't it fall apart? And Le Guin builds a world in which I think it's fair to say it is completely plausible that it doesn't fall apart, that it wouldn't fall apart. But that is only because there are some quite stringent background conditions which make this world, it's actually a planet, this planet, the kind of place that it is. There is no suggestion here that anarchist social arrangements would work everywhere and for everybody. Indeed, there's no suggestion that they would work in many places or for many kinds of people. But they work for these people in this place. The place is called Anares. The people are called the Anaresti. And we hear their story. There is a historical background here. They are a group of people who have come to this planet to escape their home planet. Their home planet, which is a sister planet, it's relatively nearby, is called Uras. So we've got Uras and Anares, the Urasti and the Anaresti. And the people who inhabit Anares once lived on Uras, but they were essentially a persecuted minority. And they were persecuted because of their beliefs, and their beliefs were a belief in this version of human freedom, that no human being has the right to compel another by force to do anything. And no institution can be allowed to capture that kind of coercion and try to legitimate it. Human flourishing is only possible when it is understood that that kind of coercion is always illegitimate. That was their faith, their creed. They had a founder, a presiding spirit who led them away from Uras to their new home. It's a woman. She's called Odo. Their creed, it's not a religion, it's a political, philosophical creed, is called Odonism. They are Odonians. This is sci-fi. And Odo gave them a doctrine, and is the doctrine by which they live. And in their new world, it has something like the status of a set of holy texts. She wrote a book called Her Prison Letters. She was persecuted back on Uras, and in prison she wrote a series of letters that become their Bible, in a sense. So this is a group of people with a shared faith, a shared conviction, and they have been driven from the place they live to this new world. When we encounter them, they're on the 6th generation. So this is a relatively short story. Clearly, there is meant to be a parallel here with the people who left Europe. The Pilgrims, as they are sometimes still called, the Pilgrim Fathers, went to the United States to escape persecution. It wasn't the United States then, it was just the New World. And in the New World, they built a new life, often in small communities that grew. But in that case, it wasn't anarchism. This is the anarchist version. We are 6 generations, so 150 years into this story. So in the American story, this is somewhere in the 19th century, but it's a recognizably 20th century world. But those background conditions, I think, aren't particularly original. You might expect a world that's going to survive under these conditions to have a founding creed, to have a founder, to have a faith. These are people with a shared set of beliefs. The question is, the founders come with those beliefs. The founders come because they want to get away from persecution. The founders are fired up with the spirit of their movement. But by the 6th generation, much, much harder to sustain. The people who are in the 6th or the 5th or even the 4th generation, they didn't run away from anything. They weren't fleeing. They weren't building a new world. This is their world. This is all they've known. So how do you get them to play along? And here, the important conditions aren't really in the realm of ideas. They're in the realm of the material world and the natural world. The key thing, I think the key insight in Le Guin's imagined anarchist utopia is that this world, Anares, it's bleak. It has very limited natural resources, enough to subsist and more than subsist. It's not simply a subsistence life that they lead. It's hard scrabble. It's often close to the edge of subsistence. And at one point in the book, the people of Anares face the real prospect of famine. So food is in short supply, and it's hard to generate enough material on which to live. So this is a planet on which there are few resources that can easily be hoarded. As I was reading this book, I found myself thinking over and over again about another book that we've talked about extensively on this podcast recently, Luke Kemp's Goliath's Curse, which described the conditions for essentially anarchic or anarchistic-like social living in prehistory. So in that case, not in recognizably 19th or 20th century settings, but in worlds that are hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of years ago. One of Luke Kemp's phrases was, in order to have that kind of life in which you do not have the Leviathan, the state, squatting over social existence, there needs to be an absence of what he called lootable resources, people able to steal, to take, to hoard, inequalities to build up. And that is the world of Anares. The kind of crops on which they live are hard to cultivate and difficult to loot. They require collective effort. Everybody comes to understand that in order to have the kind of life that they all want, which is something above subsistence level, there needs to be extensive cooperation, and there needs to be extensive cooperation, particularly in the production of food, which means most people recognize, though they may do different things with their lives, at various points they are going to have to live on the land. It's a hard life. It's also a life in which they have a whole planet to play with. So there is a lot of freedom of movement. Luke Kemp's other condition for this kind of life is there has to be exit. People have to be able to get away. If you find yourself in a social or even political setting in this world in which you are unhappy, you feel like you're on the brink of being coerced in one way or another, and you are one person, it may be that the people that you're up against make it very difficult for you to fight back. There has to be an exit. There has to be an out. And on Anares, you can get away. People simply leave situations they're not happy with. It is a world, a planet, but it is an isolated planet. It is completely cut off. So the way Le Guin sets it up is that this planet has a trading relationship with its sister planet, the place that the sister planet still thinks of it as a colony. They don't think of themselves as colonized because it's their own world. But they still trade with Uras, but it's extremely circumscribed. The only wall in this world, the only place that is fenced off, and that fencing off is backed up with the power of force, with guns, is the trading station. The spaceships that dock and bring goods from Uras and take basically mining material back, because the people in Uras think of Anares as a mining colony, because there is also another form of natural resource for which the people on Uras have a need. Within Anares, there is one place that is fenced off and guarded effectively by people who, if you didn't know better, you would think were soldiers. There are no soldiers in this world. No one can leave. No one can leave the planet. The people who do the trading, who go back and forth, are a tiny, tiny group. It is not available to the wider population. And yet within their world, anyone can leave at any time. So the circumscribing of this world is both very specific and also allows for an awful lot of freedom of movement. And there is variety in this world. If you don't like it here, you can move. There isn't luxury. There aren't the really nice places and the really nasty places. Everywhere is a mix of nice and nasty. Even the nasty, bleakest places have their advantages. Climate, the way in which people can live there. Even the places that feel most comfortable also are quite austere. But there is enough variety that people can move around to the place they will feel most comfortable in, because the point of this world is that nobody ever has to do anything that goes against their instinct as an individual about how they would like to live. It is genuinely anarchic. But another way in which I would say it's realistic, some of the realism simply comes from the constraints. And it should be said, by the way, that at this period, the communist view of the possibilities of anarchism, and in some ways the most fashionable anarchist thinker, 1960s America, was a man called Murray Bookchin, whose philosophy was what's sometimes called the theory of anarchist abundance. If you genuinely want to live in a society in which people are free to do their own thing, man, you have to have an awful lot of stuff, the stuff of life, abundance. There needs to be an absence of scarcity. Scarcity is the thing that creates the state. Scarcity is the thing that means, in the end, people jealously hoard what they have and get the power of the state to protect their property. But if there was so much stuff that no one had any need to be jealous of other people, then you could have a truly free society. And in a way, I'd say probably the abundance version of these arguments are the ones that still resonate with people. There's a lot of talk, again, in the 21st century about the need for abundance. Our societies feel so pinched and so constrained and so coercive and in some ways so cruel because they are so unequal. And they're so unequal because we persuaded ourselves there isn't enough stuff to share around. But there is enough stuff if only we built it more efficiently and distributed it better. An abundance philosophy that says that's the way to paradise. Le Guin does not argue that. She does not suggest that. She suggests the opposite. She is much closer to Luke Kemp, or maybe I should say Luke Kemp is much closer to Ursula Le Guin. The conditions that make this possible are conditions of scarcity, limited resources. Under those conditions, you can really imagine people choosing to live like this. But it's also realistic because it's psychologically realistic. A lot of the effort in this novel goes into giving us a sense of the mindset of the people who choose to live like this. This is a society that doesn't have no administrative structures. It has a bureaucracy of a kind. It's quite complicated, and so it needs quite a lot of organization. Things have to be built, have to be moved around, industries have to be managed. This is a world very dependent on science and scientific understanding. So you need educational institutes, you need research funding, you need people who are given the conditions under which they can do the work that's needed to allow this society to subsist. And this stuff doesn't happen in a purely anarchic way. There is no such thing as a purely anarchic research institute. There is no such thing as a purely anarchic factory or farm. Everything needs structure. Everything needs administration. In this world, we are given glimpses of meetings in which groups of people come together and they try and come up with a decision. I don't know what Le Guin was thinking of when she described these meetings. My suspicion is that she might have had in mind an Israeli kibbutz, or maybe versions of communal living that she'd experienced in the United States. I mean, in a way, it's very recognizable. I'll just read a description of a meeting, an admin meeting in Anaras. This is how Le Guin describes it. To report an Anaresti managerial debate in full would be difficult. It went very fast, several people often speaking at once, nobody speaking at great length, a good deal of sarcasm, a great deal left unsaid, the tone emotional, often fiercely personal. An end was reached, yet there was no conclusion. It was like an argument among brothers or among thoughts in an undecided mind. And she goes into quite a lot of detail as to how these kinds of debates might take place, and they are plausible. It's angry. People behave really badly. They shout at each other. They try and coerce each other. It's messy. It's incredibly messy. And yet there's a shared understanding, there's a shared goal. There's an understanding at the edge of what the limits are, the limits of anger or incivility. But at the same time, the crucial feature of Anaresti society is there's an awful lot of pressure to conform, to live and behave in such a way that makes this communal way of life possible. There's a lot of social pressure, including social sanction. You will be disapproved of. You may even be ostracized. If you come across as selfish, if you come across as unwilling to contribute to collective enterprises from which you benefit, if you're a pure free rider, people will let you know. They'll tell you that you're a bad person. They will try and bully you into joining back in. And everyone in this society feels those pressures strongly. But at the same time, they also feel strongly the social pressure not to buckle. These people are simultaneously conditioned in two different directions, to be good citizens and to do their own thing. And they have a shared understanding that there is no point in their way of life. There is no point in the struggles that they've been through, the generational struggles to build this world without creating a state, without building a police force, without having prisons. What was the point of all that if we're all going to conform? If we're all going to be browbeaten by each other? If we're all going to be told that we're not allowed to do our own thing? The point of this society is to allow everybody to do their own thing. So there is a lot of pressure on people to push back against the social sanctions that apply a lot of pressure to each of them. Everybody in this world is conflicted, and everybody is self-consciously conflicted. They are educated in a way of life, a system of thought, which is designed to make them uncertain as to what they should do. And in this world, you meet people who have decided to free ride, people who just want to go off and get drunk, people who want to go off and live by themselves, people who want to live a hermit kind of life. They don't want to join in. They can't bear it. God, those meetings sound awful. Imagine it. Walk away. If you want to walk away, walk away. There is a word that's used to condemn people in Anares, which is you're an egoizer. Your ego becomes the thing, and you put your ego first. But at the same time, they're also told that one of the worst things anyone can feel is guilt about anything that that person chooses to do, whatever you choose to do. Walk away from this relationship, walk away from this job. Literally, you're on the job and you just think, I'm sick of this. I'm sick of it. It's so cold here. It's so miserable. I hate the people I work with. You are encouraged to down tools and just walk out. No explanation needed. Never apologize, never explain in this world. And definitely don't feel guilty. In fact, they are almost conditioned to feel guilty about feeling guilty. Guilt is the worst thing that you can have in this world, because if you feel guilty, you have trapped yourself in a mindset which goes against the ethos of the place, which is, doesn't matter what anyone else thinks, you're free to do your own thing. It's psychologically plausible, and one of the reasons that it's psychologically plausible is because everybody is conflicted in this way. Everybody in this world has doubts. Everybody in this world is very unsure that this is sustainable, that this is a way they can live, because all of them at various points feel themselves pulled towards a way of life which is not the one that they have been brought up, not just to inhabit, but to celebrate. They are told to celebrate it, and they're also told to reject it. So one of the themes of the book is that this kind of society is the only society in which the phrase permanent revolution makes sense, a phrase that in real world political thought is often associated with Trotsky and Trotskyism. This is not in any sense a Trotskyite society. It's an anarchist society. It is pure anarchism. But it is permanent revolution because it only holds together through the pressures, the social, the emotional ties that weave all of these people into a social whole. And yet the ethos of this society is to rebel against the thing that holds you together. But more than that, in rebelling, you are upholding the emotional, the social, the intellectual basis of this society. It is the only conceivable society, I think, in which that does actually make sense. More than that, I would say, as described by Le Guin, it's realistic. It's realistic to imagine a population, not just a group or a community, but a whole population. In this world, it's a global population, though it's a small world. A population that simultaneously knows what it has to do to allow its way of life to survive, and knows that one of the things it has to do is consistently reject the pressure to conform to that way of life. Conformity in this world is rebellion. Rebellion is conformity. So the people are seriously not messed up, but conflicted. And that's what drives the plot. I've talked a lot about this book without even mentioning the plot. And only half of it happens on the planet of Anares. The other half happens on the planet of Uras. And it's a complicated structure. It moves back and forth. What happens on the planet of Anares is the backstory to what happens on Uras. And it centers around one man, a character called Shevek, who is a brilliant scientist. He is a physicist. He is potentially about to come up with a transformative, unified theory of time. He's going to connect past, present, and future in a way that is both philosophically profound, will change the way that people think, but also may have enormous practical benefits. There's a thought that if he can get his theory right, his theory of time right, it will allow for instantaneous communication across the universe. And this is a world, within a whole set of worlds. We're in a galaxy far away. There are other planets, there are other civilizations, there are other communities, there is space travel, there's all of that. It's sci-fi. And you can imagine in that world, instantaneous intergalactic communication would be a useful thing. So if Shevek can crack it, he'll change what it is to imagine time, and he'll change what it is to send someone a message. He's a scientist in an anarchistic world. There is science in this world. There is a university structure. He works sometimes in a university, sometimes not. He does some of his work on his own. He's both encouraged to work for himself and not for himself. He's encouraged to publish. He's also encouraged to share. Actually, the descriptions of university life seem to me also pretty realistic. One of the problems that Shevek encounters is that in a university, the administration tends to bureaucratic ossification. It gets strangled. Universities are places where it's very hard to keep the spirit, like the spirit of that administrative meeting, free, just a free-for-all, a shouting match, and then somehow you arrive at a shared understanding. That's the ideal. Rarely happens. Shevek discovers in his world that there are people who have captured power in the institutions, and they are threatening to capture his thought. He publishes it. They want to publish it not under his name. He discovers it's published under the name of someone else who's jealous of him, who's not as clever as him. A jealous scientist wants to steal his work. The familiar problems of this kind of life. He dithers. Does he want to do the work? Does he not want to do the work? He forms a relationship. This is a world in which the family is one of the institutions that has more or less been dismantled. Children are essentially raised communally. One of the conflicts that some individuals have, and Shevek's partner, who's called Takver, feels this acutely. Maternal instincts are thought to be a bit ego-driven. The social encouragement is not to prioritize your own children, because prioritizing your own children is possibly the seed of the creation of the Leviathan. But you've got to be free to do your own thing. So you also are totally at liberty to prioritize your own children. You may find it doesn't serve your children well because you may find yourself ostracized. Takver is totally conflicted when she has a child, because she does favour her child, but she knows she oughtn't to, but she also knows that she's allowed to. And then she feels guilty about preferring her own child, but then she knows guilt is a dangerous thing, because once you feel guilty, you're not free to do your own thing. And she goes round in circles, and their relationship is one in which they love each other. They want to have an exclusive relationship. The norm is non-exclusive relationships in this world. The family has been dismantled, but again, you do your own thing. And if you want to pair off, you pair off. We're told there's a clear social custom that if you do pair off, you shouldn't snog in public. You need to go off. You need to get a room, to use the contemporary jargon. But other than that, of course, you're free to do that. They're both conflicted. Shevek, at various points during the famine years, goes off and does hard work. He gives up the science, but he's drawn back to the science. But his conflict, the reason that he is torn, is he lives in a world in which there is one iron rule, because there is one wall and there is one manned boundary. You don't interact with the people from the planet you left behind. This world will only survive if it can be kept intact from the influence of the ideas from that world. That world is not an anarchic world. They left a world which was state-based and divided between different kinds of states. We discover that on Uras there is a place which is clearly a version of the United States of America. It's called AEO. I'll just call it EO for short. EO, and the Eonians are the Americans. They live in a deeply unequal but prosperous capitalist society, which certainly has a police force and armed forces and a prison system and a government and all of that. In this world, there are other forms of state-based existence. There is one that sounds like it is trying to do communism, which is called Thun. The Thuvians are the Russians or the Soviets, but it is a state-based world. And the people on Anares are not allowed to have contact. But Shevek is a scientist who believes in the power of ideas, and he knows science works best when there is the most open possible exchange. And he knows that the scientists on Uras are well-funded and smart, and also doing work in this field. There are more brilliant physicists on Uras than there are on Anares, and so he wants to communicate with them, and he starts to have communication with them. And communication takes place in a fairly primitive way between these two worlds, It is semi-secret, not completely secret. He doesn't feel guilty about it because guilt is not a thing. But he knows he's going against the closest thing there is to a rule, an enforceable rule in this society, which is you do not bring their ideas over here. And as he chafes against this constraint, because he is a man of science, he wants to interact with his Urasti counterparts. He eventually decides that he will go. He will travel there, which is about as blasphemous an idea as you can have in this world. But he does it. So half the book describes the process by which he arrives at that decision. And it is interwoven with descriptions of what happens when he gets to Uras. He is allowed to go. Nobody can stop anyone doing anything on Anares. So even though this is in some ways the worst thing he can do, and as he's walking to the spaceship that's going to take him, someone tries to stone him to death. This is a violent world too, for sure. It's realistic. People don't wave him off. They wish him dead. But the one thing they cannot do is physically prevent him. They can't lock him up. So he goes to Uras. And that's the other half of the book. So clearly, this is a Cold War novel. I mean, that is the other thing to say about it. It is a utopian novel. And the phrase that Le Guin uses for it is not realistic utopia. That's how I think of it. The subtitle is an ambiguous utopia, which may be another way of saying the same thing. It is realistic because it's ambiguous. It's realistic because the people are psychologically conflicted. It's realistic because the good institutions are also the problem in that world. Everything has in it the potential to go wrong. It's all quite finely balanced and precarious. It's ambiguous because it is a precarious world. The conditions for its flourishing are also the conditions which mean life there is really hard. There is no flourishing without hardship. There is no hardship without flourishing. This ambiguous utopia is also in a novel which is in a quite heavy-handed way, I think, about the Cold War. So, for instance, we know that the character of Shevek was partly based on someone that Le Guin's parents knew quite well when she was a child and when she was growing up, a young woman. Robert Oppenheimer, the man behind the movie, the man behind the Manhattan Project, a physicist, not the greatest physicist of his age, but a great physicist administrator, the man who gave the world the atom bomb and then had an attack, I don't know, of conscience, guilt, whatever it is, but spent the rest of his life somewhat agonized about what he had done. And Shevek is pretty agonized at various points, but believing that the worst thing that could happen would be that his big idea would be captured by a state. His great fear was that the American state, its coercive, bureaucratic, administrative structures, the military-industrial complex, would take the bomb and make it a weapon in its arsenal. Whereas what Oppenheimer wanted, and the reason he came under suspicion, and indeed was very nearly ostracized by the American state, what Oppenheimer wanted was for the idea to be shared. It was an idea of science. The only possibility for a safe future would be if this idea was somehow owned by everybody. He wanted free communication. He didn't want capture of the science. And Shevek is the same. If he was going to come up to his unified theory of time, which I think we're meant to think is similarly potentially transformative to nuclear fission, it cannot be captured by one people, even if it's his own people, even if it's just the Anoresti. It needs to be available to everybody. So he goes to Uras in that spirit. So here he is, a kind of Cold War scientist like Oppenheimer, trying to speak the language of universal science beyond the political divides. That's what Shevek comes to think. He's obviously going the other way than Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer, an American, wanting this not to be captured by the Americans. Shevek, an Anoresti, wanting it not to be captured by the anarchists, in the sense that he didn't want anyone to hoard this idea. Shouldn't be, even for his own people, a lootable resource. So he goes to Uras, and to start with, he's very impressed. God, it's luxurious. Wow, they have stuff that the people back home wouldn't even dream of. It's so clean. The buildings are huge. Anares has buildings. It's an impressive place, but it's provincial relative to the big city. The really exciting visions that he has from his hotel window, looking out at this amazing urban panorama. Some of it seems to him ridiculous, At one point, he discovers, as he puts it, the Urasti lived among mountains of excrement, but never mentioned shit. In the sense, this is a hidden world. All the bad stuff is hidden away. He moves among the elite when he gets there. He's celebrated. They've given him a prize. He's the great scientist. They've sort of given him their equivalent of the Nobel Prize. He comes to suspect and then to discover actually what they want from him is they want to capture the science so that they can use it for their practical purposes, for instant communication across the universe. But to start with, he's celebrated as a man of science. They have no problem with his personal philosophy. It feels like a place that's quite open. To start with, he feels like he can have conversations he never had back on Anares, where it's all so fraught because everybody is so conscious about being this but not being this and being that and not being that. And also everyone is so stretched. It's a very stretched life. Even for the scientists, you're not completely sure that in a month's time you'll have enough food to sustain yourself and your family. None of those concerns when he gets to Uras. But gradually he discovers that behind the facade it's rotten. And here, I think, is the weakest part of the book. So one of the ironies of The Dispossessed is that the utopian sections, the sections set on Anares, are really convincing, to me anyway. The word I would use is realistic. The people, and these are all humans of different kinds. Should be said, all of these places are descended from people who came once upon a time from Earth, which is known as Terra in this fictional world. The people on Earth, the humans, destroyed that planet in the way that we're destroying ours. But some of them got away, and in the end, new ways of life were constructed. The version of human existence, it is human, on Anares, is realistic, even though it is utopian. It is genuine anarchism. The version that is familiar, the real version, Shevek in the equivalent of the USA, is fantastical. It's actually quite crass. I think it's a little too cartoonish and heavy-handed because it is in part satire. There's nothing satirical about Anares. But Uras is a version of the United States in which we are meant to see in technicolor the horrors. And there's another Cold War strand that runs through the book. So not just this idea of whether there is a universal language of science that transcends these ideological borders. But within the planet Uras, there is a conflict between the American equivalents and the Soviet equivalents. They are fighting over a place called Benbili, which is clearly meant to be Vietnam. It's a place that each side is worried will fall to the other, and so they've sent troops there to fight it out. And in EO, the fact that this war is ongoing means that the society itself has become more coercive, and there are groups within EO, there are EOT, who protest the war, object to the war, and they are being crushed and repressed with the heavy hand of the state. This is Ursula Le Guin writing her Vietnam protest novel. So it comes out in 1974, the war is effectively over, but conceived and written earlier. And those bits of the book, frankly, aren't as good. They're much more like other kinds of books. The Anares sections are unique in my reading anyway. I feel like I've read lots of things in which a society like the United States of America is revealed to be corrupt, fascistic, and what brings out its fascistic qualities is the way it deals with protest. I'm saying this in a world-weary voice, not because I think it's wrong to conceive America in those terms, because America sometimes does display that face to the world and to its own citizens. But it's a much more familiar kind of critique. A realistic anarchism, in my reading, is a unique experience. A satire of the crassness, corruption, and heavy-handedness of the American way of life is not. Shevek sees through Uras, comes to believe that actually he isn't going to share his brilliant scientific theory with the people here because they would steal it from him. He has a whole series of humiliating experiences. He eventually joins the rebels. He joins the underground. He gets involved in a protest. The protest is suppressed with brutal violence. Helicopters fly overhead and gun down the protesters. So it is a very, very extreme version of some of the things that happened in the United States during the protests against the Vietnam War. It's an off-the-charts version of that. And for those reasons, to me anyway, it seemed a little too much. And yet, even within those parts of the book, which are weaker, there is still a completely compelling novel of ideas. So if you get beyond some of the social satire and some of the political commentary, Shebek, during his time on Uras, has a series of arguments with the people who are hosting him, wealthy business people, administrators, high-ranking people in the government, his fellow scientists, people with whom he connects in various ways. And at some points, he feels he has something in common with these people. Early on in his stay, he meets an aristocrat, a person who's sort of above it all, doesn't care about social convention. And he relates to this person because he comes from a world where you're not meant to care about social convention in a sense. His thought is back where I come from. We're all aristocrats in a way. So he makes a whole series of connections. In the end, the only lasting connection he makes is with the oppressed. But earlier on, he argues with these people about their different worlds and about their different ways of life. One of the arguments that he has with them is he is told by smart, powerful people in Uras that he comes from a fake world. Anares is fake. One of the reasons it's fake is that it celebrates social cooperation, free living, this anarchic vision of communities, sustainable communities, large communities of human beings who can all at any moment decide to walk away. And he's told what is idealistic about social cooperation and mutual aid when it is the only means of staying alive. You have mistaken the coercion of your conditions for the freedom of your social arrangements. You would not be free in the way you think you are if you were not so constrained by circumstances. We in Uras have the liberty of surplus goods. We are actually freer to do our own thing because we have the resources to do a whole range of things that are impossible for you. You are basically just trying to stay alive. So don't credit yourself with having imagined a new way of living. What you have done is dressed up a very pared down way of living. And Shebek rejects it, and I think he rejects it convincingly. We are free under these conditions because these are the only conditions under which it is possible to be free in that way. He reverse engineers the argument. This is a realistic utopia because he is saying, if you believe in the things that we believe in and you want to live like that, you have to go to a world where there are very constrained material and natural conditions. That's our liberation. So these are also two very different understandings of freedom. The people on Uras say, look at all the things that we are free to do. You can't do any of those things. The price we have to pay for it is a state. Fine. Small price to pay for having toilets that flush away our shit. And Shebek says, I'd much rather live with shit in a bucket and be free to walk away from any social arrangement than have a gold-plated toilet. Actually, putting it like that, I make the argument more of a caricature than it is. They each give as good as they get. But I think Shebek wins. Another argument that he has with people on Uras is about the nature of realism itself. One of the people that he argues with tells him that he is an idealist because, in the end, there is an underlying reality to all forms of social order. At a certain point, someone or some group of people have to tell other people what to do. And the people on Anares might believe that they don't live like that, but they are kidding themselves. And it is true, part of Shebek's problem, part of the reason that he left Anares, is he'd come to suspect that all of those social arrangements he was brought up to value and to celebrate, in which you fight, you argue, but you walk away, and no one ever has to do anything they don't want to do. All of them, even over 6 generations, have started to solidify around structures in which the social pressure to comply is coming close to being a form of political coercion. That it becomes harder and harder to walk away. That people who've worked out how to play the system have worked out how to play the system to get other people to obey their will. He's beginning to suspect that there might be concealed within something that is concealed within something else, an iron fist somewhere in that world. He's not sure. I think he thinks he's found a version of it in his university because people are not just disapproved of, but they're squeezed out, they're forced out. You can't do what you want to do in a system in which some people have enough power to deny you the resources, the means you need, which in a university setting is you've got to have access to the labs. So he's not completely closed off to being told that in the end, a realistic view of the world is one that recognizes whatever your ideals, somewhere you're going to encounter a version of force. And one of the things that makes Shevek himself a kind of realist is that he recognizes that. But then the argument goes further, and he's told, actually, your idea of permanent revolution is a sham because you've got nothing to rebel against. You need real realism in order to be a revolutionary. Actual revolution, actual rebellion requires something to revolt against, something concrete, something real. You have to find the iron fist. So he's being told this not by the communists, the Thuvians. He's been told this by the capitalists, by the Americans. But the implication is the Americans understand the revolutionary mindset all too well. And he's told by his Henry Kissinger-style realist, look, you're kidding yourselves if you think you're the revolutionaries. In our world on Uras, there are real revolutionaries, and there are indeed real revolutions, because there is something to try to tear down. Actually, he's told, you anaresti, you anarchists, you are just rebelling against a voice in your own heads. You are people who think that you're pushing back against something that's pressing on you from the outside, but you're not. Everything that's happening in your world is taking place inside your head, and in your own head, you have a version of the state. In your own head, you have an instrument, which is your upbringing, essentially, telling you what to do. And the best you can do, the best satisfaction that you can get in order to do your own thing, is to tell yourself that you will not do what you are yourself telling yourself to do, which is a very, very thin form of rebellion. Come to our world and people will shoot you if you try and tear down the structures of authority. All you are doing is arguing with yourself. And I think Shevek has to recognize the force of this because, in a way, it's the thing that we've had described for us by Le Guin brilliantly in the Anares chapters. A world, a set of social conditions in which there is freedom, but there is also a constant struggle with the voices inside your head. She is brilliant about the psychology of trying not to feel guilty about feeling guilty. And some of this, I think, is inspired by Nietzsche. It must be. The Nietzschean idea that the worst thing that ever happened to humanity was the invention of guilt lies somewhere deep in the background of the Anaresti story, but it's not a Nietzschean world either. It's not that kind of freedom, the freedom to dominate. But there is that almost tortured sense that once you are liberated from guilt, there's a part of you, however you've been brought up, that's going to feel guilty about that. So the description, it rings true, it lands. But Shevek has a response, which is the trouble with your kind of realism, realpolitik. In the end, what matters in the world is force and interest, self-interest, and the assertion of power, is that no society is actually like that. You hear this argument between Shevek and his antagonists all the time in the world we do live in 2026, in the United States, in Trump's America, in Pete Hegseth's America, the question of who are the realists? What is realism? Is it realism to believe that we live in a world in which, in the end, the iron fist is the only thing that counts? Or is it realism to recognize that actually the only way any world is constructed is through codes of shared social meaning, common moral understanding? The rules are not only the rules of force, and the rules of force are themselves only sustainable when they are backed up by common norms. You hear that argument all the time. The argument is had between Shevek and his antagonist. And Shevek's response is that not only is there no world which is as purely realistically force-based as you're claiming your one is. He says, I've been here. You dress it all up. You cover the shit in gold-plated toilet seats. You put your soldiers in uniform. You tell them that they're fighting for their country. You persuade people that they're free because they have forms of abundance, so you hoard most of the abundance for yourselves, because I've seen how unequal your society is. You have servants who you think are working for you voluntarily, but actually they have no choice or else they would starve. Everything in your universe is a version of itself dressed up to be something that it's not. All of your so-called realistic principles are covered by the inversion of themselves to make them more palatable. You couldn't rule here if you told people there is nothing but the iron fist, so you cloak it in a velvet glove. You call yourself the realists, and yet you can never tell the truth about yourselves. The only people who can tell the truth about themselves are the people back where I come from, Anares, the anarchists. Yes, we might be conflicted. Yes, we might be confused. Yes, we might sometimes despair of the way of life in which we've been brought up. We see its flaws, we see its faults, but we see it for what it is. Actual realism is to understand the conditions of cooperation and the conditions of coercion in a way that makes sense to all parties involved. In the series that we put out on this podcast with the political philosopher Paul Sagar about political realism, some of it turned on this very argument. The philosopher Bernard Williams, often thought of as a political realist, but his argument was it's very important to distinguish between societies in which the claims of those to get people to behave in a certain way are presented to those people in ways that both sides of the exchange can understand, even if it is coercion, even if the state is saying, we're going to force you to do this, and if you don't, we're going to jail you. Nonetheless, the argument is presented in terms that both sides can understand. Williams called that the basic legitimation demand. You've got to legitimate your power, your authority in ways that make sense to us. And then there are societies in which the ways in which the society justifies itself to those who have to behave in certain ways can never be the terms on which the people who have the power justify it to themselves. And Shevek concludes after his time in, effectively, America, having come from a world that doesn't exist, a sustainable, durable, planetary anarchist community, that he comes from a world, for all its faults and all its problems, in which the people who live in that world can justify their attempts to get other people to behave in certain ways in terms that make sense on both sides of the exchange. The exchange may go wrong. One side might feel that they are being coerced. It might turn violent. It might be extremely painful. Both sides might lose. Everyone might end up worse off. But no one at the end of it will have been forced to speak a language that does not make sense of their own predicament. Whereas in capitalist, supposedly free EO, the United States of America, the people who are living under the system have that system justified to them in terms that are not the terms by which the people who rule the system understand the essence of the system. Those people understand that it's force, but they dress it up as democracy. Those people understand that it is hoarding and inequality and winner take all, but they dress it up as the American dream. And Shevek's argument as a realistic, ambiguous anarchist from a place that doesn't exist is that his world that doesn't exist, is the real one. And I've never, ever read a book in which I found an argument of that kind so persuasive as it is in The Dispossessed. As I mentioned in that episode, as I was reading The Dispossessed, I found myself thinking a lot about Luke Kemp's Goliath's Curse, the book that we discussed in a series earlier this year on this podcast. And I wondered what Luke thought of Ursula Le Guin and whether he saw the links that I'd seen, so I decided to ask him. We have a bonus episode to accompany today's, in which I'm going to be talking to Luke Kemp about his view of this book, about whether he thinks it's a realistic account of what it would be like to live without the Leviathan, and also to ask him about his other favourite works of science fiction. If you would like to get it, it will be available tomorrow on PPF+. All you have to do is sign up by clicking on the link in the show description, going to our website, ppfideas.com, where you can see a list of all of the bonus episodes that will be waiting for you as soon as you join PPF+. It costs £5 a month or £50 for the year. You get 2 bonus episodes every month along with our entire archive. You get ad-free listening, you get automatic sign-up to our fortnightly newsletter, and you will be supporting this podcast. Also, a quick reminder that the final event in our film season at the Regent Street Cinema in London is coming up on Friday the 19th of June. The film is Never Let Me Go, and my guest will be the geneticist and science writer Adam Rutherford. We would love to see you there. To get tickets, click on the link in the show description. Go to our website, ppfideas.com. Next time in our regular slot, the next great political fiction is a work of spy fiction. It's Graham Greene's The Human Factor. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.